So this is part two of our animal interactions and habitat lecture. So what I want to talk a little bit more about in depth is habitat and why it's important for individual species to have a home area. So a habitat is defined as all biotic, climatic, topographic, and euphatic factors that affect life. So it is going to be all of those individual elements that come together and provide a safe place um, for an individual species. So habitat in the terms of, or in the context of range management, is really split up into four major elements: food, water, cover, and space. So we're actually adding space here to the three essential elements that we learned about in elementary school and high school. So let's first talk about food. Energy is going to be required for every facet of life for individual organisms. And so these organisms can gather starches, sugars, fats, and cellulose, and all of those individual components can actually be broken down and used for energy. When we talk about nutrient requirements, which we're going to do pretty extensively throughout the next couple of weeks, we're really talking about protein and vitamins. And the interaction between protein and energy are going to be very, very important for our rangeland animals. And different animals are going to use those different components at different stages in their life. So if animals are very young and growing, we're going to talk more about the protein requirements, or if they're mature, we're going to talk about their energy requirements. And then finally, we're also going to talk quite a bit about mineral requirements. And these are going to be both macro and micro minerals. But the two biggest ones that affect an animal's performance on rangeland is phosphorus and potassium. So when we think about food intake and how much feedstuffs an individual animal will eat, it really comes down to what type of digestive system that they have. So our concentrate selectors, which are going to be like birds, bears, and mice, are going to eat a very, very small percentage of their body weight per day, only 0.25%. Whereas our individuals that have a ruminant system, such as our grazing livestock species, cattle and sheep, as well as wildlife species, deer and pronghorn antelope and elk, are all going to eat about 2.5% of their body weight per day. That's on average. So realize that 2.5% may be less during non-nutrient demanding periods and much more during heavily uh, nutrient demanding periods such as birth and lactation. And then finally, our hindgut fermenters, such as horses and rabbits and some other rodent species, they're going to actually eat a greater percentage of their body weight than the ruminants by about 0.5%. Water is a very essential nutrient that kind of gets forgot when we start talking about some of these other things. So water requirements for animals that we see on rangeland are going to vary. Sheep and goats are going to be anywhere between 1 and 1.5 gallons every other day, whereas donkeys are going to be are going to need 3 to 4 gallons every day. Horses are going to be 5 to 8 gallons once or twice a day, just depending on what time of year it is and how much moisture is associated with the forage. And then cattle and bison species are going to require 8 to 10 gallons every 1 to 2 days. So cattle and bison actually consume more water than horses do, and this really fuels their microbial gut population in their rumen, reticulum, omasum, and abomasum. One area that does kind of come to the back of our mind when we're talking about available water is the actual water that's associated with the forage. So immature forage, so very new, green, lush forage that has not reached maturity yet, has lots of water in it. And at certain times, those grasses can actually have 75% water in it. So here in California, where we graze the valley annual grasslands during the winter and the spring. When those grasses come on in December and January, they have a lot of water in them. So they don't have a lot as much protein and energy associated with them because the water is diluting out those nutrients. So therefore, you have to just make sure that you have protein supplement available because the animals physically can't eat enough to make their protein requirements, even though they're standing in belly high green grass. Realize a lot of that is water. And then moving on to another component of habitat is cover. And there's two main types of cover that we're going to talk about, thermal cover and hiding cover. Thermal cover has to do with protecting the animal from elements. So thermal cover in the form of trees and tall shrubs are going to provide shade in the summer. And smaller shrubs are going to also provide shelter from wind and cold conditions as well. Our hiding cover is really essential for our wildlife species as it provides protection from predators. So we're going to see some of our ruminant species like deer and elk using vegetation as to obstruct the predators from seeing them. And just realize that pronghorn antelope and prairie dogs really don't like terrain that has a lot of tall shrubs in it. They like to be able to see out for a long ways. So this is where we see pronghorn more so in the Great Basin than we do in mountainous areas, is because they like to be able to see their predators coming from them and not hiding behind shrubs. The third major element, or fourth major element that we're going to talk about now is space. And space is very, very important for breeding and nesting sites in our upland game species. And space is also associated with an individual animal having a home range. And some characteristics of this home range is that it has to be an area where social intolerance takes place. So you can't have an area that's going to have a heavy population of predators, because that is just going to either cause that animal to become prey, or it's going to cause them to move away from that area. Therefore, it's no longer a home range. And then the home range also can feed into this concept of disease transmissibility. And so if you have a home range that has a lot of individual animals in very close proximity, similar to like a feedlot situation, but actually out on rangeland, then diseases can be transmitted from animal to animal more readily because there's more contact because of the greater population. So some of the limiting factors that we actually see with the different components that make up a habitat are are on the quality of each one of those factors. So if we limit the size of the habitat community, the size of the home range, the growth of the forages around that home habitat, and even the quality of the animal population, those are all things that can actually really inhibit or enhance the quality of a habitat. So when we talk about management programs, especially with our wildlife species, we talk about increasing the quality of habitat of those wildlife species. And the fun part about it is that our domestic grazers, like our cattle and our sheep, can actually be used to increase the quality associated with a wild animal's habitat. So some other limiting factors is the role that humans play. So this can either help or hinder. For example, if we're talking about animals in a wildlife preserve and we don't want those animals to leave that preserve, then you have to be willing to give them additional nutrients if they have times during the year that the feed is covered in snow, it's too cold to get water, etc. So because the weather patterns are going to drive migration patterns in some of these species. So you better, if you're managing to keep the total number of whatever is in this preserve at a certain level, then you need to make sure that you are managing for that. A limiting factor to human interaction is actually causing wild animals to become dependent on the humans for their survival. And so that gets to be a catch-22 as well. So some of the relationships that wild animals and our domestic animals can actually create with each other are listed here on this slide. So I'm not going to go through each individual one of them. I actually want you guys to spend some time studying them and reading about them in the book. But an example of an animal relationship that is very common that we as rangeland managers have to take into account is antagonism. So, specifically, if we're looking at sheep species, we know that sheep are smaller ruminants and they succumb to prey greater than cattle do. So, we have to be conscious of that antagonistic relationship where an animal on rangeland can actually become prey for another animal. Um, some of the relationships that we work with quite often in rangeland is competition. So when animals are going to be in competition for feed stuffs with other species of animals, so we have to be able to manage when cows come in to graze versus when the wildlife species such as deer and elk need to come in and graze, and that there's enough nutrients available for all of those different species. So this is how the animal relationships kind of play out. So on over here to the left-hand side, we've got a positive benefit, a no effect, and then a negative benefit or a harm. And we have those same categories along the top here. So if you were to select a type of relationship that caused harm and and had no effect to one individual, then that would be a mentalism. And this is so you can view the list across the top and the list across the left hand side as animal 1 versus animal 2. And you can begin to pair up how those animals are going to be in relationship with one another. So a few examples of these type of relationships are like a cougar and a deer. So an antagonism where one species is having harm come to them, that would be the deer, and one species is having a benefit come to them, and that's the cougar in the form of a deer. So we have to just be really conscious of those type of relationships because those relationship patterns are going to drive behavior patterns as well. All right, so in the next part of this lecture, you guys will get into the interaction between livestock and wildlife species as well.